Welcome to the Prevention of Depression at Work, Creating Mentally Healthy Workplaces. We're glad you're here. My name is Angie Hunt, Project Manager with the Canadian Institute for the Relief of Pain and Disability, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. This webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant Program through the BC Government, as well as donations and memberships to CIRPD. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing and to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We will collect questions submitted throughout the presentation and follow the presentation with a Q&A based on the questions submitted. Following the webinar, any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website within a week, along with the slides. You'll be emailed direct links for all of these items when they are available. As I mentioned, my name is Angie, and I'll be moderating the webinar and Q&A session. Our presenter today is Dr. Mark Deedy. Dr. Mark Deedy has 10 years research experience in the field of mental health and substance use disorders. In that time, he has worked on a range of projects at a coronal epidemiological and clinical level. He was conferred his PhD in 2015 for his thesis entitled Comorbid Depression and Problematic Alcohol Use in Young People, the Development and Evaluation of an Online Intervention. Dr. Deedy currently works as a postdoctoral research fellow for UNSW Psychiatry in the Workplace Mental Health Team. He leads the employee arm of the Well at Work project. The project, a $2.8 million world first study funded by Beyond Blue, with donations from the Movember Foundation, aims to develop a range of e-mental health tools for workers and employers in high-risk, male-dominated industries. And now I'll turn it over to Mark.
Thanks, Angie. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here. And thanks for having me. I suppose starting off, as Angie mentioned, depression was a kind of key factor in the title of this talk. But I think I'll probably touch on, I've just entitled it here, Creating Mentally Healthy Workplaces, because I sort of touch on depression. Depression is probably my area of expertise more than us and a number of others. But when we're talking about workplace mental health, it is obviously there's a range of mental health conditions that are relevant, and particularly when it comes to the overlap between depression and anxiety, there's a lot. So I think in general, this talk probably is a bit more focused around just, I guess, mental health in general. So I'm hoping that sort of suits everyone. But I guess just in terms of a bit of an overview of what I hope to talk about today, first up, I wanted to talk about what is the problem and why this is sort of a relevant problem when it comes to the workplace, I guess, more than anything. Secondly, I guess what makes then for a mentally healthy workplace, what employers can do around building mentally healthy workplaces, and I guess what's being done in this space. So in this area, I guess I've focused a little bit on the research that we're conducting at the Black Dog Institute, UNSW, where I actually work, just I guess in the interest of time, and I guess it's somewhat of a shameless plug, but I guess it kind of pulls together some of the core elements that I'm going to talk about anyway. So I thought that might be a good place to sort of slot that in. So just to give a bit more background of the team that I work for, it's a collaborative team that goes across a range of both the university and a research institute, which is the Black Dog Institute, which is Australia's only sort of university-based research program. The workplace mental health team I work in is the Australia's only university-based research program that's focused around the links, understanding the links between work and mental disorders. And the Black Dog Institute is heavily based around translational research. So the idea that we're able to, I guess, kind of develop research that has a real world impact, and in that space, at the moment, I'm working heavily around this in this space of e-health, I guess, and things like online resilience training and manager mental health training. and then within the institute, that sort of generally rolled out, certainly Australia-wide, but with the advent of the e-health space, I think it kind of goes a lot wider than that these days. So starting off, I guess, why is workplace mental health an issue? Why does it matter? And I apologise up front. Some of these data are Australian, but the figures translate pretty accurately worldwide to most Western countries. But first off, we know that 1 in 2 people will be affected by mental illness within their lifetime, based on national surveys, and whilst 1 in 5 individuals will be affected in any 12-month period. And I guess where work heavily comes into it is nearly half of all working Australians will report workplace issues as a major source of stress, and that stress has obviously major impacts on mental health. And this is, I guess, more global data in the sense that this is, so according to the recent global burden of disease study, we know that disability-adjusted life years due to mental health mental disorders have increased by 37% between 1990 and 2010, with depression rising dramatically, I guess, to become the 4th leading cause of disability within most Western nations. We also know that in separate studies across the world, in the US, the UK, and Australia, and amongst other places, we've seen the rates of antidepressant prescribing have more than doubled in recent decades as well. And over that same time period, we have this worldwide trend of mental disorders replacing, I can't really make that out so well, but mental disorders actually replacing musculoskeletal complaints as the predominant reason for sickness, absence, and work incapacity. So I suppose that's a workplace, where the workplace, I guess, ties into it. Obviously, that's a huge factor in individuals' lives, and it bears repercussions of that. And this data's a bit complicated, I guess, so I'll walk through it, but it really highlights, I guess, that point that I was sort of making on the previous slide. You'll notice that that orange line there is the only line on that's having an upward trajectory, and this y-axis represents the disability support payment recipients over the last sort of 14 years, between 2000 and 2014. And you'll see that obviously that's the only meaningful upward trend. In fact, that makes mental ill health, psychiatric and psychological disorders in this case, the leading cause of sickness absence. And obviously, in part, this is due to some extent to a reduction in the burden from some of the somatic illnesses. But the absolute cost of mental illness has ultimately continued to rise across that period. And we know that annually, certainly in Australia, depression alone is estimated at about 12.6 billion, costing society about $12.6 billion, as well as the obvious huge costs at individual level. So again, why the workplace? I guess I think the reason why there's 2 key reasons why the workplace is of interest here. I mean, in fairness, there's probably 3, but I think there's the 2 main ones I want to talk about is work obviously having a role as a stressor, as I sort of mentioned earlier, but it also has this other role, which I guess is on the intervention space. It's a perfect forum, a perfect kind of environment to, I guess, do work around mental health prevention, promotion, reduction of stigma, all the things that I think are meaningful. The third element here, I guess, is just the importance of work, which I won't touch on heavily, but we do know that just being employed, being able to work is a key factor in individuals' mental health. So the ability to work and being employed, we know that has positive overall positive impact on individuals' mental health. And I guess ultimately these links occur because of the role the work plays in our lives. I mean, we, much like school interventions or school as stressors in young people's lives, the majority of adults will spend a majority of their time in the workplace. So it does sit in this really useful space certainly when it comes to using the workplace as a bit of an intervention environment. But I guess that's sort of just, a frame of reference. So moving on, moving back, I guess, to this first point of work being a stressor, to what extent is work the issue here? Obviously, this is a very simplified idea of the way in which work may impact on mental health and leading ultimately potentially to sickness absence. That's a pretty simplified version of things, and obviously we know it's a lot more complex than that, with a number of individual factors playing a major role in overall mental ill health and mental health in general. And these impact in a range of different ways, and there's a range of interactions both ways that kind of go on here. But it's not just, I guess it's not just a range of individual negative factors. There's a range of, not only are there these workplace risk factors and individual non-workplace factors, risk factors, I think it's important to remember there's a range of protective factors both at the workplace level and the individual level. And I suppose I'll get onto a bit more of that now. And so I think this is probably returning to, I guess, a centralized workplace example in terms of what we know are some fundamental issues when it comes to the workplace that can lead to poorer mental health. This diagram shows what the literature has kind of pulled out of some key factors that play a significant role in mental health. So in the workplace, in terms of occupational, there's some key factors in terms of occupational uncertainty, imbalanced job design, and the lack of, value and respect in the workplace. So that incorporates things such as bullying, conflict, as well as social support, that kind of thing, which again, like as I mentioned, leads into the imbalanced job design. And I'll get onto, I think that's a core element that has the potential for intervention and change within the workplace, because there are small things that can be done to create more balanced job designs, increasing worker employee control and reducing demand in an attempt to, I guess, reduce the overall stress involved of work. Obviously, occupational uncertainty is at times completely outside of workplaces' control, outside of individual control. But again, this plays a key role, obviously, in the in overall poor mental health when there's a high degree of occupational uncertainty. So rather than the very simple example, I guess, I showed earlier, this kind of just walks through, some of the details of how work can become an issue and how it kind of overall a range of different components contribute to mental health and well-being outcomes. So obviously in the workplace, there are these sort of overall concepts of job design, team and organizational factors, which again contribute to demands, and as well as there's a range of significant life events going on. And then this is obviously filtered through each individual's genetics and personality, and their range of own protective factors and risk factors, which then leads to this poorer, this either poor or I guess not so poor mental health and well-being. So I guess this isn't. I suppose the thing to move to now is to understand that this is not a one-way street, and we obviously can address some of these issues when it comes to the workplace and mental health. So we know, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of it's this idea of job strain essentially, that whereby high psychological job demands and low decision-making ability can lead to what's termed high job strain. And we know the high job strain in the workplace is associated with poor mental health outcomes. This just sort of gives an impression of one of those, an indicator, I suppose, of how those mental health outcomes kind of resonate and appear. So on the y-axis here, this sort of represents, so that's long-term sickness absence. So we know that high job strain, which is that the green line moving up there, is associated with, strongly associated with with poor rates of long-term sickness absence. This data comes from a Norwegian study, and although this combination of high job demand and low control is associated with this increased risk of mental health, mental illness and long-term sickness absence. We know from modeling that 1 in 7 cases of common mental disorder could be prevented just by eliminating this combination of that leads to job strain. I guess what's less relevant, I mean, I can explain that graph a little bit better, but I think that's the main thing to take from this, and this idea that increasing, so simply by increasing, by decreasing the demands, psychological demands, or by increasing the decision-making ability of employees, that can have a huge impact on this idea of job strain, which can obviously lead to a significant impact on mental well-being, mental health and well-being in the long run. But I guess moving on to the second issue here, I think the workplace should be seen as a potential location for prevention and other mental health initiatives, and how do we kind of create that was sort of a brief example of doing some things to increase mental well-being and mental health, but how do we do more, I guess, to create mentally healthy workplaces? And I think we know that overall the successful implementation of an effective action plan when it comes to creating mentally healthy workplaces can, I guess, in a very financial sense, can lead to a return on investment of 2.3, so $2.30 on average for every dollar spent by an organization in creating these mentally healthy workplaces. And these benefits take the form of increased productivity and reduced absenteeism and what's termed presenteeism, so reduced productivity in the workplace, as well as lower numbers of compensation claims, which is obviously an additional huge financial cost when it comes to mental well-being and sickness absence. So I guess how do we kind of create these mentally healthy workplaces? And the literature kind of presents 6, I guess, underlying issues that should be 6 underlying areas in which this can be targeted. So these are broadly designing and managing work to minimize harm, which we sort of discussed briefly with those other examples. Promoting protective factors at an organizational level to maximize resilience. Thirdly, enhancing personal resilience. So again, that's this talk of when we talk of individual factors, increasing individuals' abilities to cope and that sort of thing. Promoting and facilitating early help seeking within the workplace. Supporting workers' recovery from mental illness. So that's in terms of getting, especially when it comes to sickness absence and getting people back into the workplace, and as well as finally increasing awareness of mental ill health and reducing rates of stigma. But the evidence for across these different strategies is mixed, I guess, and it's important to kind of look to the literature when we're talking about whether this stuff is the best practice, whether it's evidence based, and this just kind of gives you a bit of a flavour for what has been shown to be particularly effective. Not to say that other things aren't, but in terms of what we do know, we do know that there's the best available evidence comes from is associated with supporting workers' recovery through individual placement and support, and return to work and work-based exposure. That I suppose, and when it comes to individual placement and support, that's largely in terms of severe mental illness. But there's also strong evidence for a range of strategies that enhance personal resilience. There's also quite strong evidence for manager training and job design elements, such as I mentioned before, flexible working conditions and employee participation in decision making. Those are some of those areas of job demand that was mentioned in that previous sort of Venn diagram, which are key to developing a workplace in which the jobs, I guess, are designed in a way that are mentally healthy and promote well-being. So in summary of that, the Mentally Healthy Workplace Alliance has sort of determined, and again, this is an Australian organisation, but these are, I think these are, I guess, are universal areas of targeted action. So they are raising awareness and reducing stigma when it comes to mental health, supporting staff with mental health conditions, both within the workplace and returning to work, and reducing the risks of mental ill health, and the risks to mental health, and promoting a positive working environment overall. And I've talked a lot now about the role of mental health in creating stress, and I think that this is a bit of a framework for intervention in this space. So you can see it's probably there are elements that are blurred, but I think what's important to take from this is you can see at this low end you have primary prevention. So this is obviously amongst healthy employees, and this is simply around this idea of designing workplaces and designing jobs that minimize harm and minimize risk when it comes to mental health. So as I mentioned, that's that idea of reducing job strain, that idea of creating flexibility around jobs, and reducing demand around jobs is fundamental here. As we move along, the organisation has a key role in promoting protective factors within the workplace, and reducing stigma and increasing awareness of mental health overall. But as we move on to sort of a symptomatic or an at-risk employee, we start to talk, I guess, about these strategies for enhancing resilience and prevention when it comes to high employees that are at high risk. And this may be a job-related risk or unrelated to the job. I currently do a lot of work with emergency workers and first responders, so they obviously have specific job risks when it comes to traumatic incidents and that sort of thing. So that they're potentially at a heightened risk when it comes to a lot of this stuff. But every workplace, I think, has its own set of risks when it comes to well-being and mental ill health, whether they're long hours, whether they're dealing with customer complaints, whether they're being out on the road and away from your family for long periods of time, whether that's shift work and interrupting your sleep-wake cycles, that kind of thing. There are a range of different risks that are associated with different workplaces and as well as individual risks. And there are a range of resilience interventions at this level that become quite relevant, as well as the promotion, I guess, of help seeking while when that established illness points kind of exists. And as we move through, I guess, to this idea of tertiary intervention, there's obviously the concept here of sickness absence as a result of mental ill health, and at this level the organisation has, I guess, a key role in supporting workers' recovery from mental illness and getting employees back into the workplace. And I think that's probably I think just in summary here, we have this idea of preventative measures at this low end, and I guess reactive measures, the high end. And the whole time we have this concept of risk and moving through this concept and where risk exists and how best to manage that risk when it comes to this stuff. And yeah, so I suppose I was hoping to talk briefly now probably more about what's being done in this space, and so what's being done when it comes to individual worker interventions, for instance. And as I mentioned, I'll talk a bit about what work I'm involved in, and then I guess we can go from there, and I'm happy to field any questions on that. So first off, there's the program I want to talk about firstly is Raw Mind Coach. And the RAW there stands for Resilience at Work. It's a program that's developed based on mindfulness and CBT principles. It's brief, engaging. I think it's 10 core modules, which are focused on developing practical skills. There's also a range of podcasts and other information that users have access to, and I can provide links to access to this intervention, which is currently being run by a colleague of mine. And at the moment, a randomized control trial amongst emergency service staff is being conducted to evaluate the efficacy of that program. But we know that that's an online program. We know that obviously we're moving now into a very, I guess, heavily mobile space, and this idea of apps. And in 2013, there was over 1,500 depression-related apps in commercial app stores, but just 32 had any published research on the app themselves. In fact, we find that the apps that do a lot of the EU technologies in this space that have evidence don't have the funding and have fallen through the cracks, I guess, and individuals can't get access to them, whilst a lot of the certainly in this case, when it comes to apps that don't have evidence, still appear to be maintained, often because they are run by private companies, so they're profit making rather than run by institutions that evaluate this sort of stuff. So we've developed a program, an app-based program called Headgear, which was originally designed for male-dominated workplaces, although we're running a trial now that looking at it across a range of different workplaces and individuals. It's not a purely male-centric intervention by any means, but this population was targeted partly because of their low rates of mental health. Well, they're in general low rates of help seeking and health treatment seeking. And overall, the app contains a range of components, including mood monitoring, a toolbox in which a range of skills are sort of generated. It incorporates a risk algorithm, which is kind of core to the app and unique, and it's this idea that individuals can, I guess, see where they fit in terms of their risk of becoming distressed, I guess, and developing mental illness within the next year. And that works a lot like the algorithms that exist around heart disease, and you might go to a doctor and might go to a GP and they run through a series of different key markers and your responses on those things. So cholesterol, your exercise level, that sort of thing will lead you to being flagged at some level of risk for heart disease. This works kind of the same way, and it's based on a large epidemiological study in which that risk has been generated and worked out. And the core intervention component of the app, it takes the form of pardon me, takes the form of a 30-day challenge. Excuse me, I'm just recovering from a cold here. Takes the form of this 30-day challenge, and that contains a range of psychoeducation kind of concepts, but it's heavily based in behavioral activation and mindfulness therapy, as well as a range of developing a range of coping, building of coping skills and resilience factors. So whether that be in terms of alcohol use or sleep, developing better, healthier sleep patterns. We know that these are two, certainly when it comes to this male population, those are some ways in which depression specifically presents much more than in I guess female populations, and but also just this idea of developing healthier and healthy coping strategies in that space. So that's just a bit of an idea, and this is some pilot data which have just sort of come in now. So we've done a sort of small scale pilot of about 30 odd individuals, and we've seen that post intervention, this group has seen this nice drop in depression symptoms, and again we note so that's a significant drop. What's interesting, I guess, that this is the aim of the intervention was around depression prevention, which is difficult, I think, to measure. You end up measuring symptom drop in the short term. In the long term, you can kind of much more adequately measure the prevention of depression. But here we're looking at essentially a group at baseline with a mean of 12 on this PHQ-9 measure, which is, I guess, a mildly depressed group. But they're obviously in the workplace, and they're a very functional group. And we're still seeing a significant drop there. And we also see this significant drop over the course of the study in sickness absence. And we're seeing trends, I guess, downward trends in anxiety, and an upward trend in well-being, although those aren't significant. And it's not presented there, but the mental health sickness absence days is also an upward trend. Sorry, it's also a downward trend, but obviously there are, in a group of 30, there's quite few that will have taken a sickness absence around mental illness within that time frame. In this group there was 8, but again we had seen an overall downward trend, which was quite dramatic, but we didn't have the power to find an effect there. But it had shifted from 5 in the month prior to the intervention to 2.5 in that following month, in the month of the intervention. So I guess we're optimistic about how this can move on and be effective. Currently, we're running a large randomized control trial of this smartphone app, both at the treatment end and the prevention end when it comes to depression. Again, as I mentioned, we're funded. As Angie mentioned earlier, this project is actually funded by Movember, and so they obviously have an interest in men and male-dominated industries. But from our standpoint and an industry standpoint, when it came to our industry partners, no one really wants a intervention that alienates part of their workforce, even if it's especially I think if they know that they're quite male dominated and they don't want to be viewed that way. But anyway, so this kind of gives you a flavor of what we're looking at in terms of this group. We've finished the recruitment, but the trial is ongoing, so I won't present too much more of that. But the trial is running the Headgear intervention against a attention control. So they're not getting this control group's not getting nothing. So we are expecting that control group to have an impact. But what they're getting is a very much simplified version of the app, and it doesn't have the toolbox. It doesn't have the 30-day challenge, which I guess is the core intervention part. But they are encouraged to monitor their mood for that 30-day period. And that just gives you a bit of user feedback so far. Probably not hugely relevant, but I think it's important to just pay attention to what users are requiring and needing in this space. So moving on from that, I think what's fundamentally necessary as well is this idea of organization level and manager level training. So in this space, we know obviously that managers have a crucial role, not only I guess in well-being and incident handling, but they are required when it comes to early intervention and sickness absence management, but also this idea of team morale and overall organizational justice and organizational just the flavor, I guess, of an organization, and its sense of, well, it's the ideas of stigma and ideas of mentally healthy workplaces and well-being. Managers have this fundamental role, and we know that studies have shown that when it comes to employees that are on sickness absence, regular contact, early and regular contact from managers improves rates of recovery. So that's a kind of component of some of the training that we're doing. But we also know that standard mental health training is not enough. So starting off, we conducted a trial which is called the RESPECT study, and it was a randomized control trial within, as I mentioned, fire and rescue, so a first responder emergency service, fire and rescue in New South Wales here. And the aim was to increase mental health literacy, build managers' skills and confidence in communicating with employees suffering from mental illness, and provide guidance on managers' role during employee sickness absence. So obviously, this is a group that does have high rates of sickness absence and mental health sickness absence, and so that was rolled out in 128 fire and rescue duty commanders, half of which just had the regular training and support services. And from there, we found that managers were more confident in dealing with mental health issues after the training, and there was also a change in, I guess more importantly, there was a change in levels of sickness absence amongst those they managed. So that was a 15% reduction in workers' compensation leave at 6 months. And what does this mean for the real world? Well, in terms of fire and rescue, Fire and Rescue New South Wales, which has over almost 3,500 firefighters, we saw over 40,000 fewer hours of sick leaves, or the equivalent of 19 staff on sick leave for a full year. So just under $3 million, just under $3 million saving. So I guess in terms of financial benefit to the organisation, that's kind of where that goes. And I don't really want to focus purely on that, I think, but I guess when you're in this space and you're trying to promote this stuff within organizations, that's a fundamental selling point when you're asking organizations to kind of invest in this area. And this is sort of, again, this has moved us on to working in a e-health space. That was face-to-face delivered intervention, and we wanted to create something that was more available online, and we've developed Head Coach, which is a mobile-enabled website which provides training in much the same way across a range of areas in terms of over basically three component areas with a range of modules within each area, largely around mental health, better understanding mental health, discussing mental health issues with employees, and improving mental health outcomes when it comes to return to work, discussing sickness absence, having conversations with employees both at work and who are absent due to mental health issues, and how that works. And just in terms of the pilot data we have from that, again, this is undergoing a randomized control trial, but the pilot data indicated that we see a significant increase in the knowledge in managing knowledge when it came to managing workplace mental health, significant increase in confidence, and a significant increase in the use of management strategies to prevent and reduce stress within the team. And from there, we also saw that there was a number of those, a majority of that group would both recommend Head Coach to others, found it useful, and found the content quite accessible. And so I guess that's probably a good point to kind of leave it. But I think some of the key messages from the webinar, and I hope these kind of came through, but I'd say that I think that mental ill health amongst workers is obviously a major problem, and much of the current activity around the workplace mental health is not necessarily evidence-based. However, there's a lot of simpler, commonly used interventions, and I suppose I didn't touch on this too much, but they may not work. Looking back at that table that I presented in terms of evidence-based stuff, there's a range of things that we talk about that don't necessarily have strong evidence for them. But there are a range of new research findings and a range of new stuff coming out within this area, and there's a lot that can be done in terms of enhancing mental health and well-being within the workplace. And where to start moving forward? I suppose senior leadership is the key point here. And there's good evidence that interventions don't work without that kind of support. But there's no real single solution, and there's a range of evidence. I think it's important to use evidence-based interventions, look at good evidence and high quality education in this area, as well as an audit of the current workplace situation as well. I think it's fundamental. And there's a range of interventions that would work at various points in that journey, from a healthy employee to ill health and sickness absence, both at an individual, team and organizational level. And I think they're all important concepts to consider when it comes to creating mentally healthy workplaces. So that's just a bit of a shout out to my current team. But yeah, I'd just like to thank you all for taking part and listening in today, and anyone who's listening later as well. But yeah, I guess I can open to questions now.
Well, thank you. To our audience, if you have any questions, please enter them into the question panel and to the question box, and they go to webinar panel. Some questions that came in. Do you know of any real life examples, for instance, before and after, of companies implementing these processes? And if so, what was the outcome?
Yeah, so I think I'm not sure when that question came through, but I do think that example with fire and rescue is particularly good one. They're a group that I think it helps when you have really, as I mentioned just before, the strong buy-in from at an organizational level. And so they're an organization that do have quite strong buy-in here, and they're very interested in this space, and they do a lot of things in terms of promoting it. And I think that example in terms of the respect manager training is a very good example of what can be done with, and that's actually quite a mild intervention. It is face-to-face. I think it's a face-to-face 4-hour intervention, but that, as far as things go, is not particularly that's minor in terms of what the findings seem to be from it. So that's an example, I guess, of an organization that's really taking this stuff and moving with it. I think, yeah.
Okay. Can you talk a little more about the head coach and what kind of training is provided for managers? I'm curious to understand as well if it involves helping managers understand their own internalized beliefs about mental health issues.
Yeah, so there's three of those three topics that the first one is specifically around better understanding of better understanding of mental health in general, and that the aim of that I'll call it a module. I think the modules are actually within that, but the aim of that overarching module is both both to present factual information and general knowledge and generally important knowledge around mental health, but I think a key part there is to dispel a bunch of myths and this idea of I think this idea of stigma is still so strong in this area, so it is fundamental to kind of in that area, in that module, to actually dispel a bunch of those myths and kind of create a discourse around mental health and well-being. In terms of the other components of that program, as I mentioned, I'll probably walk through it a bit more now. I did have a slide that incorporated that, and seemed to have dropped out in my most recent thing. So I'll try to find that, and I'll put that back in for the and I'll send that through to you, Angie. But it has within each module, within each topic area, I think, is probably the best way to describe them. There are a series of modules, and then at the end of each topic area, there's a sort of testing and a bunch of exercises and testing around the skills and understanding built from those topic areas, and that's sort of the general flow of the program. It's completed. It's encouraged that sort of manage to complete it over a 4 to 6 week period. So there's not they can. Our experience is that a lot of the time managers will look to jump in and kind of do it all in one go, which is also completely viable. But it does allow for kind of a staged approach to that. But I'll tack in. I'll try to find that slide that seems to have dropped out in my most recent save.
Okay, we'll send that along to our audience. One other question that came in helping to build personal resilience, what is a good place to start? Group training?
I mean, I think group training is a useful place to start. I think I have the belief that probably a key factor here is psychoeducation. So this idea, I guess this idea of a better understanding both ill health, but also so much of psychological interventions at both the prevention and treatment end are a lot about thinking about one's own process. So it requires this sort of meta thought a lot of the time, certainly when it comes to concepts like cognitive behavioral therapy. I think in terms of, and the evidence indicates that in terms of building resilience, and I think resilience is talked about a lot, especially in this space. And I think we have a clear idea of what it is. We don't always have the clearest idea of the best way to target it. We know some things that do seem to be effective, and we know that the promotion of mindfulness and sort of acceptance and commitment therapeutic components are quite useful in terms of building resilience. But I think there's a lot of work still to be done in this space in terms of the best practice when it comes to purely resilience. We have a lot of stuff we do a lot of work to target to prevent mental ill health and to prevent depression, to prevent anxiety, and a lot of that research and a lot of those interventions are very, I suppose, quite similar to a lot of treatments for those conditions. We look to reduce symptoms, and thus, we provide people with strategies to overcome, to help, I suppose, to overcome significant challenges that may otherwise lead to depression and anxiety and that sort of thing. But resilience is sort of a newer area, and there's a range of different thought processes when it comes to it, and some will come from an area very outside of direct mental health intervention. So in terms of the idea of exercise and that sort of thing has also been shown to improve concepts of resilience and all, I think, general healthy living in terms of sleep and exercise and diet and all that stuff does have impacts on overall health. But in terms of that specific resilience thing, I would look to, I personally feel there's a lot of scope in mindfulness training and that sort of thing when it comes to improving that component. And I think group training is a nice starting point to go from there.
Okay, another question that came in stated that simple or commonly used interventions may not be effective or may do harm. What are some examples?
I might just flick back through that. Yeah, that was probably, let's see if I might just flick back to table here that's probably most referring to. So we know that anything that essentially we know that anything that can have a positive effect may also have a negative effect. And I think, that's important. That's important information, I guess, going forward. It's not saying that it will, but it's saying that it may. And probably one of the best examples of that, though, is and you're probably familiar with this. Well, some of the listeners may be quite familiar with this, because I believe this was first, the research on this came largely from Canadian studies, but a Canadian study in particular. But traditionally, this idea of psychological routine briefing after a traumatic event, certainly in terms of emergency workers and that sort of thing, was considered best practice. So that was something that was done. We all understood that to be the correct thing to do. I think it was. I think seemingly it was the right thing to do. However, when studies were actually conducted into this, it indicated that it wasn't necessarily it wasn't actually associated with overall positive outcomes, and in fact, in some cases, it led to poorer mental health outcomes when it came to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, after those routine debriefing sessions following traumatic events. So what now is considered best practice is to certainly encourage anyone who wants debriefing to partake in it, but not to necessarily, but not to force debriefing on everyone who has witnessed a traumatic event, because in some cases it may actually do more harm than good.
Okay, one last question. How do you feel about managers in the workplace contacting staff at home when they are on leave?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a tricky topic. I think this is. I think the practical side of this is always workplace specific. So I do acknowledge that none of these things are necessarily universal. But I think what the key factor is there is to create a dialogue. So if someone is, it's obviously not really a necessary thing when it comes to short-term sickness absence. Obviously, I think that's probably an invasion of privacy more than anything. But I guess in terms of creating a dialogue and creating a discussion with employees who have gone on leave for mental health reasons, especially if those reasons are work related, and especially if that sickness absence is for a undetermined period of time. I think the key here is just to encourage discussion and encourage employees to I guess I guess it's opening up this idea that this stuff can be talked about, and that the employee is still a valued member of the team, and that's I think what's really important here is not necessarily calling people at home or whatever. I think that's a case by case basis of how contact is made and exactly when. But I think it's this idea of promoting good managerial discussion when it comes to mental health and employees, I guess, feeling as though they're welcome back, and that stigma, again, that idea of stigma is not there, and they're not encouraged to stay away or stay clear because of this mental health issue. And when it comes, certainly when it comes to depression and more severe ends of mental health and that sort of thing. It's important. I think it is important to create space for employees to get back into their normal routine. Um, and this is probably beyond the workplace example, but yeah, to really just create workplaces. Well, I guess in this sense, create a roles, and obviously this is, again, I'm not suggesting this is easy, or in some cases this isn't possible, but to allow individuals to return part-time, allow changing of roles and that sort of thing, to allow individuals back into the workplace, rather than having those individuals, I guess, fall out of contact, fall out of with the workforce entirely.
Okay, that concludes our Q&A session. Dr. Didi, do you have anything you'd like to add following your presentation?
No, I think that's all. But yeah, I'd just like to say, yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for taking part. And I'll leave my contact details there if anyone is interested in getting in contact with me. But obviously you can also probably go through you, Angie. Yeah.
Great.